they came from or how they got on these vehicles, but nonetheless, Grizz thought it was a legitimate business, and he thought, why not make some money in the process? So he starts to invest money with Manny and starts to develop this relationship with Manny. All the while supplying dope to Eldorado Red and his crew down in Montgomery, Alabama. Now don't make no mistake about it. Red is living in Atlanta during this time. He lives here with his wife Hattie and his son. But you have to understand what Grizz testified to. At the time that they were dealing drugs, Grizz didn't even touch the drugs anymore. He was a wholesaler. And I submit to you, neither did Red. Neither did Red at some point. By the time that Little Fat was murdered, he wasn't touching the drugs. He had individuals doing the same thing that Grizz was doing. Receiving the drugs on his behalf and distributing those drugs in Montgomery, Alabama. At some point, 2010, 2011 comes along, and Calvin Johnson moves to Atlanta. Now, I don't know whether you believe Grizz called Calvin or Calvin called Grizz, but nonetheless, he's here. And why he's coming here, I think he testified that he wanted to pursue a basketball career. I mean, not uncommon, but he also wanted to get involved in Grizz's drug business because it was easy money. And he became a courier that transported drugs from Montgomery to Alabama. And I think that's what the facts and evidence have demonstrated during the course of this trial. And he would transport those drugs to Red and Red's people. I think even Grizz testified early on that by the time Little Fat was murdered, Eldorado Red was his exclusive customer. 10 pounds of marijuana that went for $60,000 or $70,000 in cash. He would pay $35,000 for it, but his return was almost another $20,000, $30,000. And several trips were made between Atlanta to Montgomery, and then at some point something went wrong. Something that had never happened to Grizz, to Calvin, to even the relationship between Gary Bradford and Grizz. Never happened before. They may have lost some money in the mail. They may have lost some dope in the mail. But absolutely no one has gotten robbed. And that's what happened. That's what went wrong. And Calvin Johnson gets robbed. And he testified that he got robbed. And he testified that he was traveling and ultimately got off at the Metropolitan Parkway exit, was headed toward Montgomery to deliver 10 pounds of dope. And as he's getting gas, an individual comes up to him, holds him at gunpoint. I think he describes the gun as an extended clip, and holds him at gunpoint and says, "Where's it at?" And directs him to the back of the vehicle where the box of marijuana is stored that he's transporting to Montgomery, to Eldorado Red and his crew. So he gives it up. 10 pounds of marijuana. Not going to fight over it. He's held at gunpoint. He describes him as a black male who actually drove away and in an Escalade. And he also indicates something very important, that he was on the phone with Gutter TV, who's associated with Little Fat. And that he tells Gutter TV that he's actually going to deliver some things to his people. In Calvin's word, that meant that he was going to transport some drugs. So he let him know that he was on his way to see his people. The only person who knew where he was at. And then at some point, all of a sudden, he gets robbed in broad daylight. And the question becomes, when? And as he describes it, the black male with the gun eventually drove off in a black Escalade. And the question becomes, when? When did it happen? Because you've heard a lot of that. You heard us talk about the 911 tape and how it didn't exist, that we searched for it. There was no 911 call that we could find. You didn't find any CAD report associated with a 911 call, but Calvin Johnson indicated that he called 911. And that, in fact, an officer talked to a female officer at the time. So the question is that when did it happen? Alnice Frazier testified when she took the stand that she saw Little Fat with a large block of marijuana, with large blocks of marijuana, the weekend before Little Fat was murdered. And I showed her the picture, and at some point when she was shown the picture that was taken in Little Fat's phone of the blocks of marijuana, she indicated, yeah, those are the blocks of marijuana that I saw. And so she identified that photograph as being taken in her house, and in fact identified the couch that the marijuana was sitting on, and also identified Little Fat's wallet that was depicted in the photograph. Yeah, that photograph was taken in my house, and that is consistent with the marijuana or the blocks of marijuana that I saw. Calvin Johnson testified that it was broad daylight. Grizz testified that the robbery of Johnson occurred before he actually went to Florida to party with Manny or to go conduct some business with Manny. He doesn't know exactly when it happened, but it's certainly before he went to Manny's party. And at some point, I think you heard testimony that Manny's party happened on June 2nd of 2012. Grizz also identified the photograph of weed. And this is how he did it. He says, look, I set up that whole system. I developed a system of how my weed should be marked, and while I'm not touching the weed anymore, I'm not packaging the weed, I just set up that whole system. And I can tell you that that's my dope. The way it's packaged, the way it's marked, that's my dope. That dope being in the apartment of Little Fat. Now it's interesting that the description given of the individual, short black male, extended clip, was not Little Fat. But nonetheless, Little Fat has Grizz's dope in his house, and we know when. We know that this photograph from these text messages over Little Fat's phone was taken on June 1st of 2012. So the dope had to have been stolen either on June 1st or before that photograph was taken. I would submit that it actually occurred on May 31st of 2012, and this is why I say that. First of all, I invite you to look at Red's records, phone records, 1984, on pages 56 and 57. And look at those records. Because what you'll find at some point, when dope gets stolen, some calls have to be made, some questions have to be asked, and some answers have to be given. And when you look at the records, what you will find Grizz doing on May 31st at or around 8:50 p.m. is calling Eldorado Red at least 9 times. And then if you look at the cell site location of Eldorado Red's phone, there is no data in it whatsoever. And all of the columns that reflect how this call is being handled reflects that this calls, or these 9 calls, are actually going to voicemail. And he starts his calling at 5:41. And this would be consistent with what Calvin Johnson said, because actually he's robbed in broad daylight. So he starts it at 9:41. And then 5:41. And then he calls again at 5:43. And then he calls twice at 5:44. And then again at 5:45. And then again at 5:47. And then again at 6:06, 6:13, and 6:24 p.m. He has to call and report to Red that the dope is not coming. If you review all the records in this case, you will never ever see a series of calls between Grizz and Red such as that. That is when the dope was stolen. Based upon the phone records, based upon the testimony of Calvin Johnson, as well as Grizz, because we knew it happened before Grizz went to Miami, and we knew that the picture that's depicted in that photograph taken by Little Fat's phone was on June 1st. But these phone calls reflect that there was some panicking going on. And some questions had to be asked, and some answers had to be given. And it's not to say that their relationship was going to be destroyed. It's just to say that that's a part of business. When dope is taken, you have to answer some questions. You have to ask some questions. No cell activity, so it's going straight to voicemail. And it's not until 9:07 that Grizz contacts Red. And ultimately they talk. And they talk for several minutes. But what's more important about them talking about the robbery is who Red is talking to before and after he finally talks to Grizz. That's Maurice Connor, the boy. And let me tell you something about these phone records. They are important. There's been a lot of, testimony about these phone records because as Special Agent Kevin Horan said, phones tell a story. They're scientific in nature. I think even the defense witness indicated that there's no subjectivity to them. But I think what you will see is that before and after he finally talks to Grizz on May 31st of 2012, he's talking to Maurice Connor, one of his enforcers, as Grizz would say. And what's interesting about the records as it relates to Maurice Connor and how they've been in contact with Red is this. Maurice and Red are in contact on May 16th, May 17th, May 20th, May 27th, May 31st. And then again on June 1st, June 2nd, and June 5th. And on the day that he travels up here from Alabama, him being Maurice Connor, he has absolutely no more contact with Red, at least from that phone that he's carrying. Why is that? Why is he not talking to this legitimate rapper who is the head of BGM? If he's coming up here and he's a member of BGM, he has a BGM jacket, why, if he's coming up here to Atlanta, isn't he communicating with Eldorado Red? There's one of two reasons. Either Red has another phone we don't know about, or Red is trying to compartmentalize his role in this murder. And I can tell you what they talked about after the robbery, after he talked to Grizz and then at some point talks to Maurice Connor. Hey, I got some work for you to do. I got some work for you to do. We just got robbed and we need to handle this. They disrespected the mob and we're going to do it mob style. Now, we weren't on a wiretap, but I guarantee you if we were, that's the conversation we'd be hearing. So, what happens on June 6th, the day before the murder? Connor and Washington travel to Atlanta. And how do we know that? We know it from Trooper Ryan, state trooper from Alabama, comes in here and testifies. About the nicest trooper that you're probably going to meet. I mean, let me tell you something. If I'm driving around on a suspended license and I don't have a valid ID, I'm going to jail. And I'm going to get hooked and booked. I might even be in a suit, but they're going to take me to jail. How on earth Maurice Connor and DeAndre Washington don't get arrested that day in an effort to prevent the murder is beyond me. But nonetheless, this reflects that he is en route to Atlanta. He is heading 85 north on this interstate, and he is stopped by Trooper Ryan because he is going 95 miles per hour. Reckless endangerment. He could have easily arrested him for that if he wanted to. Very easily. But he continued to give him a break. Continued to give him a break. And how do we know that? I think it's important because what this photograph depicts is what is he doing? He's using his cell phone. And that's one of the reasons how we were able to confirm where he was at. Special Agent Horan testified that this is where his cell phone was located. Right there, right near the Opelika exit. Right in Alabama, almost in Columbia, almost headed toward Georgia, almost crossing the border. he is on his way to Atlanta, and what does he say during that traffic stop, which is so important? He gets pulled over for speeding, 95 miles per hour, doesn't have a license on his person. He's driving on a suspended license. He does have a valid ID. And Trooper Ryan came in there. He does have a valid ID, and Trooper Ryan came in there and indicated that he had an ID. And that's how he was able to run him. And he came in here and identified Maurice Connor as the driver of the vehicle. He also, Trooper Ryan also identified Main Easy, DeAndre Washington. And the way he was able to do it is because at some point he's talking to the passenger. He noticed that the passenger is extremely nervous. This little artery is just pulsating. Because they know what they're going to do. And because what they were going to do, there's no doubt that they had guns in this vehicle. Was there a reason to be nervous? When you're going 95 miles per hour, DeAndre Washington doesn't have a license or an ID, so he can't drive the car away. So if Maurice Connor gets arrested, what is he left to do? There on the highway. Somebody's got to come get him. But at some point, he takes Maurice Connor out of the vehicle and into his trooper vehicle, and then they're just chopping it up. They're just chatting. And one thing that was so telling during this entire interview, or during this entire encounter, was at some point Trooper Ryan asked him, "Where are you headed?" And he says, "To Atlanta, Georgia." And more importantly, you know what he says? "I'm going to a funeral. I'm going to a funeral." And he says, a funeral of a granddaddy, I think he says in the tape. Now eventually, at some point, Detective Williams interviews him, and he talks about a funeral of an uncle. Can't even give the uncle's name. But at this point in time, on June 6th, as he's headed towards Atlanta, he says he is going to a funeral. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we know whose funeral that was. It was pre-planned. It was predestined. They conspired to commit it, and that was a funeral of little Fat. So he wasn't lying about going to the funeral. He wasn't lying about going to a funeral. He was just lying about who the funeral was of. June 6th, as soon as he gets up here, at some point he is in contact with Grizz. And his phone is pinging off of a tower near the Garden Plaza Hotel at or around 11:57 p.m. Plot the records yourself. I mean, they're not subjective. Just put in the longitude and latitude. Johnson's cell phone on June 6th from 12:02, it's actually a.m. to 12:19 a.m. is at the Garden Plaza Hotel, and this is actually leading into June 7th. Exactly where Maurice Connor's at. Same time. You might be asking, where's Bradford's phone? It was on the 7th. But remember what Special Agent Horan testified to. When you look at the records, between 6:50 and 2 a.m., there is no cell activity, no longitude and latitude coordinates on Bradford's phone. And it's either not functioning right or it's powered down. And that's why it's not getting any activity. And that's why you don't have any plotting for Bradford's phone on the 6th at the Garden Plaza Hotel. We know he was there. Calvin Johnson testified to it. Grizz testified to it. But the reason why his phones don't reflect it is because his phone is off. This is just another cast slide that reflects that they were near the Garden Plaza Hotel between the early morning hours of June 7th, 2012. And look, you know, Special Agent Horan was given the name of a hotel. And we gave him the wrong name. That's our fault. But what he said is it didn't make a difference. Hotels across the street. I think J.T. Williams testified that it was about 300 miles, or I'm sorry, about 300 yards away. It's across the street. The phone of Johnson and Connor are pinging off the same phone, which would be consistent with what Johnson and Grizz testified to with respect to tracking the vehicle to the hotel on June 6th and June